change and health. Now let's move into session 2 on the sustainability of sports in a changing global environment, plus the integration of sports in the global environmental economy. Sports presents broad opportunities to promote environmental awareness, capacity building, and far-reaching actions for environmental, social, and economic development across societies. We will discuss the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change 5 principles for sports for climate action and identify ways of reducing its impact and supply chains through the positioning of sustainable innovation, especially in a COVID-19 environment. This session will be moderated by Stephanie Pascal, our Hey Ambassador, represented Dominica. Stephanie, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Ashley. So again, my name is Stephanie Pascal, the Hey Ambassador for Dominica, and I am honored here today to chair this session, which deals with the sustainability of sport and climate change. And with me, I have my esteemed panelists. They're all professionals in their own right and experts in their field of sustainability and sport. So firstly, we have Ms. Lindita Xhaferi-Salihu, who is the head of the sector's engagement in climate action as part of the UN Climate Change, UNFCCC, wider global climate action work. Mr. Matthew Campelli, who's a strategist, communicator, and journalist specializing in sustainability and sport. We have Mr. Dan Reading, who is the head of sustainability of Murfree, followed by a climate justice officer with the Bohemian Football Club in Dublin, Mr. McCabe. And then finally, we are joined by Dr. Jessica Murfree, who is an ACE fellow and visiting assistant professor at Texas A&M University. So the format of this session will follow this same format as the previous one, where each of the panelists will be given a short time to make a brief presentation, and then we will open the floor to a Q&A discussion where I implore and I invite all the attendees to post their questions in the chat box, just so that we can have a really riveting discussion here today. So without further ado, I would like to call on Ms. Lindita Xhaferi-Salihu to make her presentation.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Let me just give me just 1 second to share my screen. I hope you can all see mine. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So good morning, good afternoon again. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Lindita and I serve at the UN Climate Change Secretariat. We are based in Bonn, Germany. It's a great pleasure to speak with you today. I take this opportunity as well to thank Ashley and UNICEF colleagues for putting together this important summit. Like many of you and many of us, I'm a huge sports fan. I enjoy the fighting spirit and the pushing of limits and boundaries, the feeling of joy and inspiration, and just seeing how one develops, grows, and becomes a better person, a better citizen, and a healthier individual through sports. I have 2 teenage daughters, so I'm now also a growing fan of rowing, gymnastics, and tennis. Sports is a big part of their lives for our family and for this community, as it is for so many throughout the world. What sports does really matters. But like so many fans and like all of you, I'm worried about the impacts of climate change in general and on the sports sector. It's simple. The weather affects everything you do, your ability to host games. It impacts the health and safety of athletes. And let's be frank, it hampers the ability to make money. Jobs are attached. This is why just going, this whole thing is just going to get worse if it's not dealt with. And that's why you're here today, to explore how sports sector can be an integral part in our collective global efforts to address climate change and to keep action and momentum going on that front. I don't need to tell you that this and last year, for the most part, have been very challenging for so many throughout the world. COVID-19 has altered lives, economies, and the nature of business on every continent, from the largest cities to the smallest villages. While individual physical distancing was necessary, what we've seen is that global collaboration on problems that affect us all have been very important and vital, and they still remain to be so. We also saw how decisive and effective policy responses can alter the course of the disease. But at the same time, we know that climate change did not disappear with this pandemic. It remains the greatest urgency of our time, and many of previous speakers have said that as well. I do not need to tell the Caribbeans anything about climate impacts. You know better than anyone how vulnerability to climate change looks like. Yet on a global level, we have just recently seen the scientific report on climate, which has a clear message. Climate change continues to outpace us and our collective ability to get a handle on it. But also that we still have an opportunity to change the course if we seriously start acting today. And acting today means working hard, working together, helping and empowering each other, learning from each other, and holding each other accountable. We've always been consistent in saying that governments alone cannot address the climate emergency. The IPCC, or the scientific community, has said this as well. Businesses, investors, regions, and sports sector as well, all must do their part and significantly boost their climate ambition. If businesses haven't yet read the writing on the wall, they're likely already behind. Sustainable business, responsible leadership are things that you're hearing more and more every day nowadays. And all of these are being demanded by science, by public, by youth, increasingly by regulators as well. And we should also be consistently demanding these as well. That's why the UN Climate Change designed Sports for Climate Action framework to give sports an opportunity to come together and do two things. One, to walk the talk, work to reduce their environmental impact in line with what science is telling us. And two, to use their microphones and their voice to inspire action amongst their peers, amongst their fans, and amongst global citizens as well. And whilst doing so, work in collaboration with one another to share ambition, to share lessons, and to empower organizations which are less fortunate or have less capacity to respond with the right tools and knowledge. Sports for Climate Action is not meant to provide a feel-good story. It's not meant to just look good on a press release. It's about working with the sports sector to define what sports of 21st century would look like, to make sure that climate change is not destroyed, because that's exactly what will happen if we don't start taking climate change more seriously and if we don't boost our collective efforts to respond to it. So to succeed in this journey, and this was said many times today, it takes teamwork, it takes multilateralism, and it takes sports buy-in. That is why we're deeply appreciative of our signatories, about 240 signatories coming together. Some of them are in this panel and were in the previous one, for working together, for bringing their knowledge on the table, for trying to find solutions to some of the challenges. And certainly we hope that we will be able to bring in many of the Caribbean sports in that conversation as well, and that of many other developing nations as well. So what does it take, and what is Sports for Climate Action trying to achieve? Sports impact on our climate is complex and is difficult to measure. I don't know that somebody has done a proper measurement of the impact of sports on global emissions, but even addressing it will depend a lot on geography and on size of the organization or event. But most sports organizations and fans would now acknowledge that sports' contribution to climate change through associated travel, through energy use, through construction, food, and so on, is considerable. Moreover, sports' global interest for billions of fans and the media coverage generated in response provide really strong platforms for sports sector to play an exemplary role in meeting the challenge of climate change. So in Sports for Climate Action, we're focusing efforts on 5 areas. as we were trying to translate what the goals of Paris Agreement could look like for sports. Together with a lot of sports organizations, we have defined the following 5 principles, which are then to be further elaborated by individual organizations. But what these principles are asking are to really depart from business as usual models to look at coming up with the more sustainable business models. It's the first principle, if you look at it, asks organizations to embed sustainability considerations in their business. And what this means in practice is certainly senior management and overall organizational buy-in and commitment is a prerequisite for a successful climate and sustainability strategy. Implementing climate targets is likely to necessitate changes in behavior and in decision-making throughout the organization. In some cases, it also requires establishing an internal accountability and incentive system, depending on how large the organization is. And also, more importantly, to provide adequate resources to achieve those targets. This will be difficult, if not impossible, without senior management commitment. So, sustainability needs to be embedded in organizations' DNA going forward. This is what this principle is trying to achieve. The second principle asks organizations to work on their climate neutral plans, depending on where they are on their climate journey. What this means is they will need to understand what their impact on climate is. Where does it come from? What are some of the quick wins that can easily be addressed? And what are some of the issues that cannot be addressed by single organizations, but maybe they could if all sports got together and created a united front to influence policy, to influence industries that they interact with. So in terms of measuring, everybody thinks, well, this is going too technical. We don't have resources, but right now we know what needs to be done. I think there's plenty of resources out there. And at the same time, we have working groups where we're trying to bring the knowledge that already exists among these sporting organizations to inform others how to start measuring their emissions properly, and how are they going to then address them in terms of reduction? What are some of the opportunities to avoid creating new emissions? But also looking at what do we do with those emissions that we are not able to address right now, or maybe there are no solutions to address them right now. Here we talk about offsets, for example, but only as a final step after you've done your homework to really see what are some of the reduction opportunities for your operation and for your supply chain. We are currently working with signatories to set best practice targets that are aligned with net zero or with 1.5 degree. We need to collectively halve emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero in the 2040s. Now, most importantly, what needs to be said here is that action needs to start immediately. We cannot be stuck in the commitment level and in the measurement level. We need to start with action as soon as possible. And for credibility of commitments, it's also important that progress is reported. Now, progress is not relevant to name and shame. That's not why we want to use it. But it's more to see where these organizations are, what are some of the challenges that are faced, that these organizations are facing, and how can we help to address those collectively. The third objective is really to bring together and diffuse lessons learned already, resources, tools, and expertise, and to try collectively addressing potential knowledge gaps. We have seen that in sports, there is a significant knowledge gap when it comes to how to address climate impact. So this principle is really to try and bridge that gap and empower organizations to understand climate change issues in a global and regionally relevant context, and then incorporate those lessons into their strategy. At the same time, of course, there's a lot of education that can be tailored towards athletes, technical teams, and fans as well. And we're seeing that with a lot of our signatories as well. The fourth principle is very much about influencing emissions that you cannot address right now yourself. So this is to really get an organization to a level where it starts adopting sustainable procurement policies to motivate providers, service providers and product providers to develop cleaner options. we know that, we need to create that demand for sustainable options in order for them to be available. Campaigns could be built to promote the use of greener, sustainable options. This also applies, for example, to giving preference to sustainable means of transport, being one of the major sources of GHG emissions in sport. But by doing so, you could also support this global transition to low carbon transport. So there's a lot of opportunities that we see there for all these signatories to come together and create a really powerful signal in terms of transport and in terms of other services that sports use. And the final, of course, principle is very much aligned with what everyone has said: the power of sports to influence change, to inspire others to follow climate action journey, and the immense popularity of sport and its emotional attachment for fans creates a very significant opportunity for sport to engage people on climate issues. We've seen some activities led by teams and athletes, and there's just wonderful scope to engage fans there. But to date, implementation on climate action has been fairly limited. We're seeing more and more of that happening in the last year, especially. However, we know that sports are associated with rules, with referees, clear demarcation of teams, and importantly, basic notions of what constitutes fair play. So a key aspect of sports for climate action is really inclusion of fans and communities in this journey. With the growing awareness that climate is changing and we all have a role to play, fans are getting used to sustainability-related themes. So this great unexploited potential for more direct engagement of fans in climate action must be leveraged. And there is a great work that's being done already, as I mentioned, by some organizations to activate sport communities. For those of you who don't know, for example, Planet Super League are really doing great stuff to engage football clubs and so on. But this could be, of course, scaled further and scaled on a global level. We have about 240 organizations involved. Not all are starting from the same starting line, but we all need to get to the same finish line. And that's the challenge, but the initiative is really designed in a way to allow any sport organization, governing body, association, federation, club, and team to join, regardless of where they are in their environmental journey. Now, being part of the platform will help sports enhance and showcase their action to sport community and to the world, but most importantly, to identify really solutions to some of the challenges that can only be addressed collectively. And finally, I'd like to encourage this audience in particular to take up this challenge. I hope that we caught both your ear and your interest, because I'm going to ask you to take the next step. We need all organizations in this sector to be part of the solution, regardless of where they are. And being part of the solution means committing to come up with clear plans on how their contribution would look like and work with peers to develop solutions that do not exist. Our system is built in a way to drive unsustainable practices. This needs to change. We all know that by now. And to do that, we need all voices around the table. This isn't going to be easy, but it's absolutely necessary. It's also necessary for the future of sports. It's hard to imagine how organizations will survive with games being canceled due to extreme weather. It's hard to imagine anyone will want to compete at any salary in those conditions as well. Sports is more than just entertainment or recreation. It's a global business, and therefore its decisions matter. We're convinced that sports will start to make the decisions necessary to build a clean, green, healthy, and a more prosperous sector and future for all. If anyone can do this, sports can, and we will be there to do all we can to support them along this journey. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lindita, for that very comprehensive and informative presentation, especially in regards to the principles from the UNFCCC. I feel that was very critical part of the presentation. Up next, we have Mr. Campelli, who is a strategist, communicator, and journalist specializing in sustainability and sports.
Hey, Stephanie, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for having me today. About 3 years ago, I attended a conference, physical conference, of course, where two well-known sports journalists that I admired, spent their whole session explaining why women's sport wasn't covered extensively in many publications, including their own. I might be paraphrasing here a little bit, but their main justification was that it's not commercially viable. And many people in the audience were dismayed, and there was a lot of pushback from people in the audience as well. And a few years later, significant growth trajectory. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing that women's sport is in a healthy place in terms of interest and potential revenue generation. Now, this might seem a little bit off topic, but the point of this story is that some people in the sports industry and some organizations can often be a little bit behind the curve in terms of wider societal issues and trends. If I had $1 for every time I heard a sports industry executive mention a Nelson Mandela quote about sport having the power to change the world, I'd probably be able to change the world myself, to be honest. But in order for sport and the people and organizations within sport to live up to this billing, Mandela's billing, it has to get with a program in a genuine way. And as we've heard today, the current and future program is very much about safeguarding the health and safety of people in the face of the COVID pandemic, but more pressing climate change. The latter and the way we address it is the defining issue of our times. We've heard it many times today with the existing panelists. And the IPCC report that's been heavily referenced throughout this presentation was stark. It was really scary. Where I'm based in Europe, I'm sandwiched between nations that are experiencing horrific wildfires and devastating flash floods. So the world looks pretty scary from Europe now as well. Now, sport, of course, shouldn't be expected to solve problems on this scale alone. As a sector and industry in general terms, it doesn't manufacture anything and it doesn't directly burn fossil fuels. On the scale of industries that can have a direct impact on mitigating climate change, sport is a little way down the list. But as we've heard, in cultural terms, sport is hugely significant. And that's what the UNFCCC Sports for Climate Action framework that Lindita just went through a few minutes ago is hugely important. It focuses the people working in sport on the matter at hand and goes some way to demonstrating how sport is being massively impacted by climate change and its consequences, like extreme heat, like the air pollution that Bob was talking about in his presentation, poor water quality, etc. The sports industry can't hide from the fact that it does have a carbon footprint, though. Like other companies and industries, clubs, leagues, and federations must measure and reduce the negative impact on the environment. And as Lindita kind of alluded to, there are some awkward questions to be addressed around extensive travel of athletes and spectators, the development of new facilities as well. However, it's my firm belief that if sport really does want to change the world in terms of climate change mitigation, Principle 5 that Lindita talked about of the framework, advocating for climate action through communication, could be and probably is the most important. Sport has a myriad of important stakeholders that it interacts with on a daily basis all the time. We have fans, commercial partners, suppliers, local authorities. All of those actors do have the ability to take huge climate action, and sports teams and athletes can be the conduit to that big message. It's important when we talk about communication that we caveat that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and we can go through this in a little bit more detail during the Q&A. There are different audiences that I've mentioned that will have different priorities, different challenges, different behaviors, and any messages that sports organizations want to push out around climate change and sustainability should be crafted around these points. Much of this means ripping up the existing rule book and going beyond the status quo. For example, it's well documented that sustainability communications in general terms needs a little bit of a makeover. There's too much cliche language still and too much focus on the macro when people generally are known to care about personal, local issues. Now, this could work very well to sports advantage if harnessed correctly. Soccer teams, cricket clubs will have more success in engaging local fans in climate change issues that affect their communities, that affect their families, their health, their jobs, than presenting them with this overwhelming specter of global warming that feels very, very overwhelming and very big for them. We're also seeing a handful of forward-thinking professional sports organizations engage with sponsors who haven't traditionally sponsored sport because of their sustainability story, which is authentic, compelling, and very specific. It's not cliched and it's not macro. I was really pleased to see Bob on the previous presentation because I'm a big fan of what World Athletics is doing with regards to its approach to air quality and how it really identified it as a major issue for its key stakeholder, recreational and elite runners. A couple of years ago, I was invited to interview the president of World Athletics, Seb Coe, about the initiative, which was still in its infancy, still in its embryonic stages at the time. And I was really excited about it. I took an 8-hour night train from my home in Austria to Zurich for what was scheduled to be a 15-minute interview. Because I really wanted to meet Seb Coe, first of all, and I was really interested in the project. So for me, it was worth it. But when we sat down and I mentioned sustainability, that 15 minutes turned into a 40-minute conversation. And he said something that I found pretty poignant and pretty important ever since. And he said, it's important that our sport has something to say and has the ability to be practical about the big issues. That for me is the attitude that sport must have if it wants to get with the program in a genuine way and genuinely change the world. And I'll be happy to talk about these points in more detail during the Q&A. Thanks very much, Stephanie.
Thank you, Matthew. Before we go into the next speaker, we'll be having a short video by World Sailing. So World Sailing is the governing body who is responsible for sailing, So similar to how we have FIFA for football and ICC for cricket, we have World Sailing for sailing.
It's magic. When you are in the ocean, you forget about everything.
You have all different kinds of conditions out there, so it's very exciting.
I always hated to do like sports inside. I feel like I can't breathe.
Going through the water so nice. It's like a feeling you can't describe. You're almost like you're flying.
の戦いなので、風を読んだりだとか、潮の流れを読んだりだとか。You have to deal yourself against the sea.
Stephanie, will we share the video one last time?
Okay, no problem.
I can just go straight into the presentation if you like, because it's basically a video summarizing a couple of thoughts from some sailors. So it was just to give a bit of an intro, but shall I just crack on?
Okay, that's no.
We'll like to show your video, so we'll show it now.
Okay.
Sailing with 20 knots, going fast is a paradise.
It's magic. When you are in the ocean, you forget about everything.
You have all different kinds of conditions out there, so it's very exciting.
I always hated to do like sports inside. I feel like I can't breathe.
Going through the water so nice. It's like a feeling you can't describe. You're almost like you're flying.
まあ、自然との戦いなので、風を読んだりだとか、潮の流れを読んだりだとか。You have to deal yourself against the sea, the wind.
Kind of battle against the elements.
At the end of the day, you're at the mercy to the sea and just how powerful it can be.
É muito interessante porque a gente fica nas mãos da natureza, né?
The technology, the speeds the boats are doing and the sizes of the boats.
Feel like you're harnessing what's actually happening and being able to control it.
Много перемен, все зависит не только от тебя.
Different kinds of boats, you have 10 different classes.
Giant yachts flying, a meter in the air at 40, 50 knots. It's just unbelievable.
I think sailors are definitely really aware of the environment.
O atleta que usa aquele espaço para treinar e para competir se preocupa com ele também. E aí mobiliza outras pessoas.
That's our office, that's our playing field. I think it's really important that we do all we can.
Okay, thank you for that. Before we move on, I just want to remind our speakers to please stick to the allotted time. We have 3 sessions after this, so just to ensure that everyone can go accordingly and we can have a healthy discourse afterwards. So Mr. Reading, without further ado, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Hopefully you can see this, my screen now.
Yes,
yeah, I can see some nods. Okay, great. So as introduced, World Sailing's the international federation for the sport. Oh, could we put our microphones on mute, please? I'm getting some feedback. Thank you very much. So yeah, we're the international federation that looks after dinghy sailing, big boat sailing, windsurfing and kite surfing. And we're formed like other international federations of our national authorities. We also have class associations. So we're formed of 145 countries. We run our own events, the Olympics, and sanction large events as well. So I normally say we're like FIFA, but for the sailing world. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about World Sailing's approach to reducing carbon emissions. I'll talk about the following points. So really getting our own house in order first. So we signed up to the UNFCCC Sports for Climate Action Framework. But crucially, we have carbon reduction policies in place and measures across everything we do to measure and, importantly, to reduce. There's certainly opportunities to engage participants and fans, as we've heard earlier. We don't have as many participants as some of the other sports, but we still have about 70 million participants and 275 million fans globally. So engaging with them about reducing carbon emissions is crucial, and that's how we can have more of an impact as a sporting body. I think as well what I'll touch upon a bit is how we can influence the wider marine industry. The recreational marine industry is a $100 billion industry. We set rules that affects that industry, and so electrification and transition from combustion engines is something that we're looking at, and this is really exciting. And just finally, I'll touch on how we can influence associated industries and how other sports can also do this. So our sport at the pinnacle has the best designers and engineers in the world. And if we can use that expertise to apply to the shipping sector, the impacts could be huge. This is already happening in some respects. Our coatings partner, for example, has reduced CO2 emissions on ships by 10 million tonnes through essentially super slippery hull coatings, making them more efficient going through the water. So sport as a whole can influence broadcast, sponsors, clothing, branding, suppliers, and we're just getting started. So to Lindita's point earlier, getting a coalition of sports together to work on these important sectors is really exciting. So just to give you an example, looking at putting things into perspective, this is World Sailing's carbon footprint. It's roughly about the same as 4,000 people's carbon footprint if we're taking the average of 4 tonnes globally, but our influence can be significantly higher. So you'll still see World Sailing there just about. The recreational marine sector, there's no reliable figures, but we know, as I mentioned, it's a €100 billion industry, so it's quite significant. And then we've got shipping. So shipping accounts for almost 3% of global emissions. And when we look at, I mean, I couldn't make the dot any smaller with World Sailing, but it probably would be. It's how we can affect these different industries. So getting on our own house in order, we've got, I'm not going to go into any detail, but we have our own sustainability strategy with 56 different targets adopted in 2018. We look to contribute towards 12 of the UN SDGs, unanimously supported, so we have the mandate to deliver against these. 5% of our sponsorship income is ring-fenced for sustainability work, and we have quite a few targets specifically on carbon reduction. So as I mentioned, trying to influence the people, you can't really see the text there, but in terms of influencing the sailors, so the 70 million, we've created lots of resources. Sailing's a technical sport, so there's an element of training. So educating the sailors of tomorrow is, I think, one of our biggest opportunities. This is an example of some resources we created we put it into 14 different languages that teaches young sailors about the sport, but also key environmental points such as climate change, as you can see here. In some countries, we know that climate change and some other environmental subjects do not feature on the curriculum. So sport is an avenue to engage the youth on this subject. We have a number of ways in which we can work with the wider marine industry, which I'll talk a little bit about now. Within our gift, and as well as many other Olympic federations, we select the equipment that is used. So we added what we call life cycle assessment to the selection process, and encouraging the marine industry to start adopting those techniques. So we don't buy anything actually, but we specify. So we specify what equipment is included. So our windsurfer manufacturer, for example, completes life cycle analysis as well as reducing their energy use. And with board production using renewable energy, they also carbon balance the boards to make them 10 times carbon positive. One of the things that we're also looking to do is to share best practice with all the different manufacturers. So that's for marine industry and beyond. And within contracts, we specify carbon reduction and showcase opportunities for our events, which they're contractually obliged to do. Lastly, on this slide, we have regulation. So we regulate the sport, and a number of ways we can look at emissions through design regulation, materials, or limiting number of boats, support boats at events. So that's something else that that we and other sport federations can do. So there are other areas that we not in scope when we're talking about world sailing's scope 1, 2, and 3, but actually we can definitely have an impact on. And an example is the grassroots sailing infrastructure. So for sailing clubs where we're heavily reliant on that infrastructure, is something what we've started to address. So creating tools to help assess and reduce energy use, as well as other environmental issues. The events that we sanction, like the America's Cup, Sail GP, the Ocean Race, we have mechanisms for mandating a focus on carbon reductions there as well. And I did talk about regulations, so we have set some others for boats that are being produced for certain ratings. They have to create 20% renewable energy on board. And also looking at events about carbon literacy, which is engaging with the athletes. And we heard earlier about how they can be great advocates. And finally, something we've got is called Challenge 2024, which we are challenging the marine sector to diversify from combustion engines that are used in support boats, and working with Paris 2024 to deliver that. So fine, just wrapping up. This is something which it's semi-concept, because some of these are in build phase now. Fixed wings, which were originally developed for sailboat racing, specifically America's Cup, and we're seeing as well on Sail GP at the moment. They've been redesigned by some of the teams and being designed to be used on commercial ships. So we're kind of going back to a couple of 100 years using the winds to power some of these ships, but it's something that can drastically reduce emissions. And as I mentioned, that they account for a significant amount of global emissions. We also have something called foiling, which when boats are essentially flying out of the water, which makes them much more efficient because there's less drag. So whilst you can't do it for big ships like this, smaller commercial purposes, that's something that I think we're going to start to see a lot more of. So reducing carbon emissions there. So that was quite quick basic summary of what we're doing at World Sailing. So if anybody has any questions, happy to take them a bit later. These are some of the channels that you can follow and see what World Sailing is doing. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dan, for that. Up next, we have Mr. Sean McCabe, who is a climate justice officer with the Bohemian Football Club in Dublin.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to everyone at the Hey Campaign for organising such a fantastic gathering. I have not got a presentation, but I do have a holding slide, so you don't have to look at me while I'm talking. So I'll just pop that up really quickly. It's an image of our football ground here in Dublin at the top, which is Dalymount Park. We're a small team by global standards, but a big team in the community. And a climate march that took place in Dublin here before the pandemic, obviously, when things were a little bit easier in that regard. So just to kick off, I've been saying a lot. I've been working on climate justice issues for about 10 years. And I've been saying to friends recently that I really wish I had thought of bringing climate justice together with football a lot sooner, because you can spend an awful lot of time trying to draw people's attention to these issues of existential importance. But football has a way of communicating that few other things in the world do. And so that's something that I would like to focus in on as part of this presentation. I know it's been touched on a lot by previous speakers. There are opportunities, obviously, for sport to become more sustainable. That's been said. And sports will be a big part of whatever economy does survive and emerge from the climate crisis and the bigger environmental crises. I don't really want to go into that as part of this conversation. What I'm keen on focusing on here is inequality and what sports can do, and particularly football can do, which other organizations can't. And that's to gain the trust and confidence of millions of people around the world. That trust and confidence, if it's treated respectfully, not cynically, but respectfully, can be a game changer in our fight against the climate crisis, against the biodiversity crisis, and help to drive fair and inclusive solutions. But before I get into that, let me just tell you a little bit about my role with Bohemian Football Club. It's not my primary job. I work in a think tank here in Dublin, which has a Centre for Climate Justice, which I manage. And then I also work on strategy for the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, which is one of the supporters of today's event. But Bohemians are a football club who I love, and they play in the Premier Division of the League of Ireland. Now, the League of Ireland probably doesn't compare that favorably to other leagues around the world, and that it's quite small. It's got a small fan base, but I think we punch above our weight in many ways. The club, Bohemians, is fan-owned, which makes it quite unique in the world of football. And it has been fan-owned for the entirety of its 130-year history. So no investors, no big outside money. All the money from the club comes from the fans. And it's a club that's operated sustainably, profitably, democratically, and it aims to have a very positive impact on the community which surrounds it. So just for example, we've worked with Amnesty International recently to raise awareness and funding for refugees and asylum seekers coming to Ireland. Our jersey, our away jersey, carried a Refugees Welcome logo, and all the proceeds from the sales of those jerseys went to support Amnesty and resettlement programs in Ireland. This year, proceeds from our away kit sales are going to support homeless services in Dublin. The club has a team for blind people, an amputee team, a program to rehabilitate prisoners and reintegrate them back into society, and so on. I've been doing work on community-led climate action for a while, and I had engaged this club about an idea of bringing them on board with some of this community-led work. And actually those conversations ended up creating this position that I'm now talking to you in today. We've been active for about 6 months only, so it's quite a new initiative. We are already signatories of the UNFCCC Sports for Climate Action Initiative, which is a fantastic thing to see growing, and Lindita has spoken to that in detail. We're working on initiatives to reduce and eliminate waste from the club, to engage with environmental NGOs to plant native woodland, a tree for every club member every year. We're looking for the redevelopment of the ground, which is happening anyway. We're looking at ways in which that can become a kind of a lab for innovative stadium development. But that's all to one side to what I want to talk about today. You know, the areas of opportunity for environmental sustainability in football or in business, as Lindita said, like, they're really obvious and they should be tackled head on. We shouldn't still be talking about how, you know, impressive it is that we're doing anything in this line. It's a matter of life and death, and it just needs to be done. There are obvious areas in relation to football. Transport generates significant emissions, match day footprints, etc. The manufacture of paraphernalia kits. None of this is rocket science. It should have actually begun a long time ago. Where sport can really be a game changer, in my opinion, is helping fans and participants navigate the crisis that we face. And also it can speak up for the voiceless and people who have been ignored so far in this crisis. People on the front lines of climate change who've done the least to cause the crisis, but are suffering worst and hardest. That's the first step. That is the injustice of climate change, and something we have to rectify. Football clubs and sports teams must get serious about standing up to perverse inequality, both globally and locally. In 2013, research by the Wall Street Journal gave us a particularly galling example of this in the sports world, where they told us that to run the Dallas Cowboys stadium in Texas for a single match requires more electricity than the entire country of Liberia in West Africa. A similar statistic is that the World Cup in Russia created a larger carbon footprint over the weeks that it ran than the country of Malawi did in that year. These are very significant inequalities. I could speak, you know, and there's numerous ways in which clubs can undertake very real climate justice initiatives, and I'm happy to talk about that in the questions and answers. We're already looking at ways in which putting solar panels on stadiums could help to create the type of giant community battery that could be used to tackle local energy poverty in communities. You know, we can think about tree planting driven by efforts to offset clubs' footprints. And as Lindita rightly says, offsets should be the last thing considered. But meaningful offsetting might look something like using the planting of trees to address inequality in terms of access to green space within our cities. In Dublin, and like in many other cities around the world, those areas of communities with access to green space tend to also be the wealthier segments of society, and the poorer segments of society don't have that same access to green space. That's a way in which football clubs working with local government could push back and change that and build into that sporting facilities and other ideas. I just want to finish on one point around global advocacy, because I think this is where sports and football in particular can be really, really powerful. Some of you may know, and some of you won't, that there's an ongoing campaign to have the right to a healthy environment recognized by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. This would be a significant step forward, both in terms of tackling the crisis we face, and also in terms of ensuring justice as we transition. It would help to guarantee people, no matter where they were in the world, a right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in which people could thrive. Now, the countries leading this push could, as early as next month at the Human Rights Council, table a resolution for its realization. Imagine if the sports world, and I've begun this conversation with colleagues in football across Europe, but imagine if we had all of those sporting clubs in Europe, or just the football clubs, come out robustly behind Costa Rica and those other champion countries who are looking to drive this resolution home. Imagine the attention that would bring. And it would really focus the eyes of the world, not just on Geneva, but also that victory in Geneva would be such a victory for people and planet, and it would give the entire international community a significant lift before COP26 in Glasgow in November. So sport has this huge potential to drive political leadership to do what is right and protect the planet for future generations, and do it in a way that's equitable and inclusive and gives voice to those who are currently being ignored in the resolution. So beyond getting our own house in order in terms of sport, I think this should be our primary objective. Just like to say thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions about our initiative or that global campaign afterwards. Thank you, Neb.
Thank you so much, Sean. We will swiftly along to our final panelist for the session, Dr. Jessica Murfree.
Hola, Dr. Jessica Murfree. Attempting to share my screen. Hopefully you can see the slides now. Let me know if you can't, but yes, that should be good. All right, perfect. All right, so good morning or afternoon for some of you, I know. And for those of you familiar with my institution, howdy, thank you so much for having me, and to Stephanie for constructing this dialogue. It's been a pleasure working with the Hate Campaign ambassadors thus far and hearing your ideas and discussing the future of climate action in sport. I am just really honored to be here. This short presentation will serve as an introductory primer of my work related to this topic. So first, what is sport ecology? It's the study of the bidirectional relationship between sport and the natural environment. So now under this umbrella, there are many fields and different avenues that this relationship can be applied to, including environmental sustainability, social sustainability, conservation efforts within sport and recreation, and climate research within sport. And so my work falls into that last category. Specifically, I focus on social and legal responses to sports climate vulnerability, which we've discussed a little bit this morning already, as well as issues of environmental justice as they pertain to sport, something else we've also talked about, but also recreation, physical activity, and health. We mentioned in the first panel that all of those issues kind of fold together, and that remains true here. So as you can see and hear from me, I threw a lot of terms your way just now. So let's look at a few things visually. So sport ecology's bidirectional relationship can be imagined as a two-way street, right? You are headed in a certain direction, there is oncoming traffic coming the other way. So sport impacts the natural environment and the natural environment impacts sport. And climate studies in and outside of sport management operate in the same way. Here, just in reference to the sports that we enjoy and that we've covered so far as being vulnerable, as being threatened by conditions of the environment. So some of the key issues in this space are financial loss and hardship due to events of extreme weather, health risks as a result of a changing climate, the exaggeration of other social disparities that are compounded by the environment, and the adjustment and regulation or otherwise structural changes to sport due to our changing climate. So we are actively moving forward into a period where we won't be able to enjoy sports, we won't be able to watch or play them as easily or as feasibly as we have in the past. And this goes back again to the discussions we've had so far about our connection to the environment and our connection to sports. So I'll provide just some examples of the work that I do. Here's just a brief list. And I'll dive into a couple of these a bit more because we're talking about, the global economy. So I'll provide some emphasis on that in particular, but examining game contracts to make sure they're written from a current climate understanding or that scientific foundation, working on pairing the SDGs to their applicability in sport, scrutinizing the ways that environmental injustices overlap with physical activity and recreation, and what that means for health, specifically of youth, like many of you in the audience, and then also determining sport fans' willingness to adapt to climate change as a result of climate vulnerability that different sports face. So just diving into those a bit more, this examination of football game contracts is really important because we've highlighted the injustices so far. those who contribute least to climate are typically those who are most impacted by it. But it was really important to understand what this looks like in the United States, a country that is highly developed, has a lot of resources, is very much actively contributing to the state of climate, but also really reveres sport and its social importance and its social status, not only in this country, but around the world. So every year, about this time of year, we are kind of plagued with tropical hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean. And there are climate adaptation strategies in place to help protect sport from changes in climate. However, these events are happening more frequently and they're getting more severe. And hurricane season in the United States and college football season in the United States, another very important season, they almost overlap perfectly. But these games are governed by legally binding contracts that protect the parties and ensure each game happens. But from an examination of these contracts, we found that there's a lot of money at stake, over $1 million in many cases, due to the cancellation of such games as a result of extreme weather events, specifically hurricanes, that are not expressly provided for in each game contract. So the language in a game contract tells you what protection, what doesn't. And we found that these contracts are not written from a current understanding of climate realities, leading to fewer opportunities to enjoy college sport, but then economically significant losses in money each and every year. And those instances continue to increase. Another one, and this was my doctoral dissertation, an overview of Major League Baseball fans' climate change attitudes and fans' willingness to adapt as a result of the league and individual teams' climate vulnerability. If you know anything about baseball in the United States, it is historically America's favorite pastime. It's kind of a big deal, also a summer sport that it's really important to American culture, and that culture has spread around the world. We've covered some of these points already. You know, the United Nations suggests that sport can be leveraged for climate action. Through this study, I suggest that perhaps sport is the lens through which the realities of climate change can be seen. We talked a little bit about COVID already. That was something that hit everyone kind of all at once, where climate change is more of that leaky faucet that's building up over time. There are a lot of disparities and injustices related to it, but it's pretty easy to see the effects of climate change when they're happening to sports that people really care about. And that those people in this case would be the sport fans. So just a recap quickly of this study, Major League Baseball in the US is uniquely vulnerable to climate change. There are a lot of teams. They're spread out over the nation. And the duration of the season is long and through some really grueling months. However, climate change attitudes and risk perceptions vary across the general public, and the average MLB fan demographically is least likely to support climate action. And that is kind of the opposite of what we're hoping to do in this session today. But from what I found, people are generally emotional about the effects of climate change, but especially when it happens to them, when they have personal experiences. So that reduces the psychological distance between a person and the myth of climate change, or the thought that climate change happens to other people elsewhere. It brings it home a little bit. Looking at risk perception, so how fans perceive risks specific to the sport, the fans were more likely to have those regardless of how they identified with the sport, whether they were a diehard fan, a casual fan, or somewhere in between. As long as they perceived climate change was a risk to Major League Baseball, in general, they were likely to perceive it to the sport. And then that leads to action, because having these thoughts does nothing unless we do something about it. So adaptation willingness was not influenced by how highly identified a fan was with Major League Baseball, but fans who did perceive climate change risk to the sport were more willing to adapt or more willing to change their behaviors. And so what this tells us is that Major League Baseball fans conceptualize climate change risks to the sport as something bad. And then from the fans, if the sport, in this case baseball, was threatened by climate change, they'll do something about it. And together that starts to uproot this historical lack of support and climate action in the United States. So if it can happen here, where there's a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of development, perhaps it can happen elsewhere too. So the focus really has been on some pretty sad, depressing, hopeless information. Climate change is not a positive thing. So to move forward, just some points for hope. The image here is a sunrise in the town that I currently live in. First, there are a lot of people and organizations working with a common goal. There are committed academics that have dedicated and devoted their careers to advancing climate action and climate adaptation within sport and pro-environmentalism through sport. There's also been a global awakening and resurgence of climate action over the last 18 months, really coinciding with the pandemic. And sport remains this powerful tool to transform and inspire in a lens through which the realities facing our planet can easily be seen. And that last one, you are here. You've already done the first step. And that's really important that we take these elements of despair and turn them into something positive, because we care about sport and we care about this planet. So I didn't have much time today, but I'm happy to discuss my work further and perhaps ways you can get involved. Don't hesitate to reach out. My email is there, my Twitter is there, but I'll turn it back because I believe I was last to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murfree, for that very thorough presentation. Unfortunately, we are very strapped for time. And so as a result, I will only be asking one broad question to all of the panelists, which I feel is not an issue because all of your presentations were very thorough. It was easy to understand and we did receive a lot from it. So the question I have is, it has to do with what can small or local, I should say, what can local or amateur athletes do to play their part in the fight for climate change? Because all of you spoke here today and you all spoke from, an organized, you all spoke from a fully recognized organization and an international body. But as Mr. Stout said in the beginning, that a lot of persons, especially here in the Caribbean, we really do not have that structure. So what can we, like smaller local athletes, do to play their part in the fight against climate change?
Oh, do you want me to kick it off? I don't know who's is that directed at all of us, but I would say, firstly, looking at your infrastructure. So if you use some kind of a club, if you use a leisure centre or whatever that might be, typically there's always ways to reduce the carbon footprint if it's looking at the energy use, if there's green tariffs, etc. And then also to use your purchasing power. So as a consumer, look at the sportwear, sport equipment that you're purchasing, making sure that you're choosing equipment that can be used for a long time. Can it be serviced? Can it be upgraded? So I think as individual kind of athletes, that's something that we could all do.
Thank you, Mr. Lindita. Lindita, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, not much to add. I think we can also start as individuals and look at how our lifestyle is currently. How is it looking? There's always room for improvement when we look at things like food preferences and waste and obviously electricity and so on. But I think what is important for Grassroots, and I know that James is here and he'll give a lot of examples on how communities are mobilized, but I think we heard from Susan as well in the beginning when she was talking about this global assembly. She was saying we need to all be informed. We need to know what are the existing solutions and then try to come with solutions that are more ambitious than what we're seeing, right? So the human creativity has no ending. So I think it's important to look at what are these conditions where we're finding ourselves, and then understand, is there an impact that we can address? And as was mentioned many times, when we talk about sustainability or transition to sustainability, we have to also think about these different geographical conditions, right? And the transition will need to be just, and just transition obviously is, at the heart of the Paris Agreement. So I think it's important to think in the context of sustainable development goals. How can we develop in a more sustainable way? Can we, ask for more sustainable products and services? Are we in that position to do that? And if not, then all we can do is, mobilize communities, try to get them the right knowledge, because I think the sustainability and climate landscape has become very busy. There's a lot of noise and it's very hard to understand what is right and what is wrong. So I think really getting that right understanding and trying to paint a picture of how the future could look like, which is difficult. But I think this is where we need to focus a little bit. There is a better future than this one, but we have to be vocal about it. We have to be vocal about what we need, and we have to be part of that system that builds it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Sean, I see you really resonate with what she was saying. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's key. And I think as we think about how we visualize a future, we kind of have to tell a very positive story, the story of success. We don't really spend enough time thinking what that looks like. Now, a little analogy from our own experience, we're not a large organization. In fact, we're quite small, and our board is voluntary. And our club is a cooperative. It's members owned, so it's a cooperative. And if you think about it, if you can own a football club, you can also own a wind turbine as a cooperative, or you can own an array of solar panels. You can even start to look at flood defenses and things like that. So what we really have to understand is that there's a massive global transition taking place, and that transition will more than likely result in winners and losers. And communities have to try to seize the power that they can, both literally and figuratively, and try to own some of those elements of the transition so that they benefit. At the core, climate justice is about sharing the benefits and burdens of climate action equitably and fairly. And to do that, we need to understand that we can own the solutions. No matter how small a community you are, you can get the support to put up a wind turbine and see the resources flow back into your community from that. So owning the transition is very important, and we should never consider ourselves too small to be a part of that.
Thank you. Jessica, you would like to go next?
Sure. I just kind of wanted to jump in again on that same thread and those reminders for hope. I think it's important to keep in mind the mental toll that getting involved in climate action can have, especially as a group of young people who have their entire lives and careers in front of them. It's very easy to get bogged down by the headlines and the news that focus on the despair, but to stay involved and to keep active, it's really important to take care of yourself first. And then there are plenty of ways to get involved at any time. There's no need to feel behind. You can start being active in the climate space when that is ready for you. The main or the most important thing really is that you have to live safely in the society and the environment that currently exists. First and foremost, before we can do anything to make any improvements, you have to be safe and healthy as best as you can. And then remind yourself that the climate emergency is not your fault. those two things together can help propel you into a space where you're able to be creative and generate ideas and communicate effectively with others without succumbing to a lot of the emotional toll that comes with being involved in this type of work. So I really think that's important, and it takes constant reflection and something that even someone like me needs to be reminded of pretty frequently.
Thank you so much for that, especially ending on a lighter note. And finally, I'd just like to call on Matthew.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, just to reiterate what Jessica was saying, hope is a very important thing. And my feeling is that local athletes and local sports organizations and clubs are going to be critical in this, particularly when it comes to kind of swaying people who are perhaps skeptical about the kind of wider, global focus on climate change, making things local and more tangible and more about local communities and how it affects people's jobs and health and families, I think can make it connect a lot more to people than this kind of big macro thing that seems very overwhelming. So local athletes and local clubs can play a really big part there, I think.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So that concludes session 2. Just to remind you who the panelists were, we had Ms. Lindita Xhaferi-Salihu, Head of the Sector's Engagement in the Climate Action as part of UN Climate Change, UNFCCC, wider global climate action work. Mr. Matthew Campelli, our strategist, communicator, and journalist specializing in sustainability and sport. Mr. Dan Reading, who is the Head of Sustainability at World Sailing, followed by Mr. Sean McCabe, who is our Climate Justice Officer with the Bohemian Football Club in Dublin. And finally, Dr. Jessica Murfree, ACE Fellow and Visiting Assistant Professor at Texas A&M University. Thank you so much, guys, for your views, and back over to you, Ashley.